This video was possible with the help of the Wolf of YouTube. Enjoy!
By the late 1920s, following the atrocities of World War I, the rise of the new dictators had begun to throw a shadow over the Far East and Europe. World peace was once again under threat. In Italy, it began when an ambitious rebel-rouser set his followers marching on Rome. The country, like every other country after the last war, was torn by political unrest. Hard times, unemployment. Two courses were available to the Italian people. They could solve their problems in a free, democratic way, or they could let someone else do the solving for them. They made the tragic mistake of choosing the second course. They put their trust and faith in this one man. The Italian people believed that by supporting Mussolini, they had a leader that would represent their interests. In fact, he planned to betray them for his own selfish interests, just as he had done with the previous group that had supported him. Mussolini worked hard to establish a power base in northern Italy. In August 1922, the government was unwilling to act firmly in the face of a general strike. Mussolini mobilized his black shirts and they marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel, fearful of a civil war, asked Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini moved quickly to stamp out all political opposition and assume dictatorial powers. Germany had an even more forceful demagogue, Adolf Hitler. Just like Mussolini, he too had the sinister opportunity to take advantage of post-war chaos. Germany was in turmoil. The knock-on effects of World War I had meant a tough lesson for the German people, and times were hard. The German army, and through them the people, had never acknowledged German defeat in the last war and were anxious for revenge. That Hitler could promise them. The wealthy and powerful industrialists were fearful of losing any of their wealth and power and were ready to back anyone who would retain it for them. This man cunningly played all these ends against the middle and ruthlessly set out to murder the newborn German Republic. On the other side of the globe, in Japan, things were a little different, but not much. Here, not one man, but a gang disguised their little schemes as the will of the emperor. To the Japanese people, the emperor is God. Taking advantage of their fanatical worship of the god emperor, it was easy to take away what little freedom they had ever known. In Italy, Germany, and Japan, the people surrendered their liberties and threw away their human dignity. They gave up their right as individual human beings. They became a part of a mass, a human herd. Although these countries were far apart and different in custom and language, the same poison made them much alike. Each got a new uniform. In Italy, the new bosses wore black shirts. In Germany, the shirts were brown. In Japan, they hid behind the uniform of the army, but really they belonged to a sinister secret society. The Japanese symbol was a black dragon. Both Hitler and Mussolini had sinister symbols too. These symbolized a new way of life and a new order for the people of Europe. In Germany, they called the new order National Socialism, or Nazism. In Italy, they called it Fascism. In Japan, they had many names for it. A new era of enlightenment. The new order in Asia. The new way of life had begun. But no matter how the people saw it, to the rest of the world, it was old-fashioned imperialism. These three were to alter the course of history. They were about to launch the world into a global conflict which would last for 6 long years. "Stop thinking and follow me," cried Hitler. "I will make you masters of the world." And the people answered, "Stop thinking and believe in me," bellowed Mussolini, "and I will restore the glory that was Rome." The people answered. "Stop thinking and follow your god emperor," cried the Japanese warlords, "and Japan will rule the world." And the people answered. Each system was alike in that the constitutional law-making bodies gave up their power. The Reichstag in Berlin, the House of Deputies in Rome, the Diet in Tokyo. And these elected representatives simply became collections of stooges, rubber stamp organizations, applauding on cue to the words of the leaders. Each system did away with free speech and free assembly. Each system did away with a free press and substituted a press controlled by the party. Through their ministries of propaganda, each took complete control of the theatre, the movies, the radio. Every cultural activity and every channel of information was controlled by the most important members of the party. Each did away with free courts and trial by jury, and substituted courts and judges run by the party. Each abolished labor unions and the rights of bargaining for wages.
Abteilung 6, 310 mit 1-3-114 beim Kranbau. Danke. Halter! Lassen Sie weiterarbeiten. Weiterarbeiten!
And under the pretext of patriotism, each established a system of forced labor. Each enforced its decrees by an army of secret police who held the power of life and death over every individual. And for the few who still believed in freedom and said so, there was a ready answer. The greatest intellect in the world can be silenced with a gun. That is an exact translation of the sinister words of the black shirts. Whenever I hear anyone mention the word culture, the first thing I do is reach for my gun. This, they believed, was the answer to a new way of life. The naked aggression of the Japanese in Manchuria horrified the Western democracies who were still bent on ridding the world of war. The League of Nations sent a committee of 5 to Manchuria, headed by Lord Lytton and General Frank McCoy, to investigate. In October of 1932, the committee issued its report.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
Shortly after, the League condemned Japan as an aggressive nation.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Matsuoka, délégué du Japon. I call on His Excellency, Monsieur Matsuoka, delegate of Japan. It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
In answer, the Japanese delegates, believing there would be no military force behind this condemnation, smiled, took up their briefcases, and marched out of the League. More than Manchuria was now doomed. Collective security was dead. The green light had been given to the aggressors. The subsequent course of history is clear. This one incident, so many miles away, was the first indication that the world was heading for war. To the man working on the land, or in the streets of London, or the pavement cafes of Paris, war seemed an absurdity. But to de Graille and his fascist party in Belgium, Le Roc and his Cross of Fire party in France, Heinlein in Czechoslovakia, and the National Socialists in Austria, war was inevitable. Even in Britain, Sir Oswald Mosley offered himself to the people as a Hitler with an Oxford accent. These men would endeavor to make easy Hitler's vision. These subversive fascist organizations provoked riots and rebellions, creating scenes like these in France, scenes like these in Belgium. Even the United States had its own fascist rebel-rouser. This amazing scene was in Madison Square Gardens, USA. Fritz Kuhn, leader of the German-American Bund, hid behind the American flag, but was in actual fact taking his orders from Berlin. His followers also used the same Nazi methods to dissuade disbelievers. In 1932, without warning, the Japanese attacked the Chinese city of Shanghai. They met such stubborn resistance that they had to pour more than 75,000 troops into the conflict before capturing the city. This resistance made them decide to shift their campaign to the north. In 1933, they add the province of Yehol to Manchuria. The Japanese launched the second phase of their so-called Tinaka plan, but they had yet to finish it. A united nation stood against them under the inspired leadership of General Chiang Kai-shek, who was to lead the long, bloody fight against the Japanese for the years to come. At the same time in Europe, Italy and Germany were planning their own campaign of terror. Despite the conditions laid down by the Treaty of Versailles, their military strength was growing rapidly. Hitler, however, was not yet ready to strike. But Mussolini was. His people were growing restless. Fascism hadn't produced the heaven on earth that he had promised them. Mussolini believed that launching a foreign war would divert attention from troubles at home. So Mussolini looked for an easy target to hit. Ethiopia would be that target. Its army had no machine guns. Its army had no tanks. Its army did have an air force, exactly one old aeroplane. One aeroplane against a nation that developed the new theory of total air war. A blitz would wipe out cities, destroy civilians, men, women, and children. In October of 1935, following the Japanese example, an incident was provoked at the little settlement of Walwal, near the border of Ethiopia and the Italian Somaliland. Italy's army had been violated. Refusing any arbitration, Mussolini moved the whole might of his army through the Suez Canal to overrun the undefended country. Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, appeared before the League of Nations. I must still fight on until my tardy allies appear, and if they never come, I say to you without bitterness, the West will perish. Members of the League half-heartedly stopped trading with Italy, but refused the only thing that would stop any aggressor: force. Ethiopia was left to itself. people of Ethiopia, with their spears and bare hands, faced the guns and tanks of the invaders, fighting desperately and gallantly to save their country from conquest. They fought and they died. But in the end, without foreign intervention, there could only have been one outcome. Eventually, might triumphed. Italy conquered Ethiopia. Many of the world's elected leaders warned of danger ahead.
Without a declaration of war and without warning or justification of any kind, civilians, including vast numbers of women and children, are being ruthlessly murdered with bombs from the air.
Just 2 months after Mussolini's conquest of Abyssinia, attention turned to Spain, where civil war erupted in July 1936. In 1923, General Primo de Rivera had established a dictatorship in the wake of a series of weak governments. His rule lasted for 7 years, and was brought to an end by the Depression. In 1931, a left-wing government came to power. Its first target was the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. King Alfonso was forced into exile and a republic created. Left and right-wing governments now alternated, polarizing political opinion. In the February 1936 elections, the parties of the left, combining in a popular front, narrowly overcame the right, which included the extremist Falange, founded by Primo de Rivera's son. This was banned, provoking street violence between left and right. Otherwise, the Popular Front's reform program was modest, but strikes and unofficial land seizures caused the right to fear that a communist takeover was imminent. Elements of the Spanish army became very concerned and believed that only armed revolt would ward off the communist threat. This was especially so in Spanish Morocco, where the troops had been campaigning for many years against the indigenous rifts. General Francisco Franco, the commander, raised the flag of revolt on the 17th of July 1936. Mainland garrisons also rose, and the government responded by calling for volunteers to defend the Republic. Military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed. Civil war now erupted with all the ghastly atrocities that such a conflict brings. Franco still had to get his men across the Straits of Gibraltar to the mainland and ask the Germans for help. Before July was out, Juncker's Ju-52 transports from Hitler were landing in Spanish Morocco. Mussolini also sent aircraft. Soon, Italian and German troops were also being sent to Spain. In Spain itself, the nationalists, increasingly supported by German and Italian aircraft, opened 2 fronts. In the north, they set out to clear the enclaves on the northwest coast. Simultaneously, Franco himself was thrusting north towards Madrid. By the end of 1936, Madrid was enveloped on 3 sides and virtually in a state of siege. The Republican government had withdrawn to Valencia, and Germany and Italy had formally recognized Franco as the new head of state. Mussolini, fresh from the conquest of Abyssinia, was keen to show off Italy's military powers in pursuit of wanting Italy to be seen as a major power. He sent a large number of troops and over 700 aircraft to fly alongside Germany's Condor Legion. Hitler saw the conflict as a weapons testing laboratory. This was especially for the new tank force he was developing, and for the Luftwaffe's latest models, especially the Messerschmitt Me-109 fighter and Juncker's Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. what happened next shocked the world. An air attack on the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937 was especially horrific, with 6,000 being killed. Stalin's interest in Spain was more obscure. While it might have been common interest to give active support to a left-wing government, Stalin was more concerned by the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. He was looking to the Western democracies to help contain them and did not want to offend them too much. Rather, he saw the Spanish Civil War as a means of keeping Germany and Italy occupied, while he continued to build and improve his own armed forces. Even so, the Russians deployed some 700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. Hitler had by now built his army to such a strength that he was ready to unveil the German might and terrorize his intended victims into submission. A would-be peaceful world soon learned that a vast military power had materialized out of nowhere. A power controlled by Hitler, the man who had no regard for treaties and promised his people a Reich that would last for 1,000 years.
Deutsche Jugend, alljährlich begrüße ich mit euch anlässlich des Reichsparteitages die Millionenmasse aller unserer deutschen Jungen und Mädchen im ganzen Reich. Zeiten kommen und vergehen. Generationen wachsen oft heran, ohne dass es ihnen vergönnt ist, wirklich ein großes Schicksal zu erleben oder gar mitzugestalten. Unsere Generation hat die Vorsehung auserlesen, Großes an unserem Volk zu erleben und Größeres noch an ihm zu gestalten. Ihr seid nun die Zeugen geworden eines großen geschichtlichen Vorgangs, der sich oft in Jahrhunderten nicht wiederholt. Ihr seid selber in diesen Jahren Kämpfer gewesen für dieses neue, größere Deutschland. Unermesslich sind die Aufgaben, die uns gestellt sind. Wie immer sind wir nicht erzogen in den alten Generationen, sondern es wird erzogen immer und immer. Wenn nicht einmal die Vorsehung von meinem Volk wegnehmen wird, dann werde ich dem kommenden Führer ein Volk hinterlassen, das eisenfest zusammengefüllt und zusammengeschlossen ist. Dafür seid ihr mir alle, Junge und Junge, Mädchen und Mädchen, Garanten. Und der hat immer noch in deutschen Landen am besten gebaut, der vertraut auf das deutsche Volk. Und das seid ihr.
The world watched in disbelief as the strength of military forces became clear. The awesome Luftwaffe was perhaps the one force they feared most of all. This would be unleashed soon enough. In 1935, Hitler had sent his forces into Saarland, bringing it back into the German fold. This was to be the first of a series of territorial acquisitions carried out by Hitler over the next few years. Not all of those acquisitions would prove bloodless. German and Italian forces had been fighting in Spain. General Franco had, in his revolt against the Republican government, invited and received German and Italian aid. The duly elected government received some Russian aid. The democracies evolved a formula of non-intervention. Spain was Hitler's and Mussolini's opportunity for a dress rehearsal for a full-scale war, an excellent chance to test their new weapons and tactics. The Spaniards were the guinea pigs, men, women, and children. It was a long war, ended finally by hunger in 1939. In March 1938, without warning, the German armies marched over the Austrian border. It was really only a full-scale invasion test, and Hitler rode in triumph into Vienna. Even the very name of Austria disappeared from the map. Though Hitler had promised earlier to the world, the assertion that it is the intention of the German Reich to coerce the Austrian state is absurd. It had been said earlier by the Kaiser that he who would conquer Europe must first haul the bastions of Bohemia. And Bohemia was now part of Czechoslovakia. But Czechoslovakia was tough. It had a good army. It had good equipment. It had one of the finest munitions plants in the world, the Skoda Works, which Hitler wanted very badly. It had the incorruptible President Hácha. It had a military alliance with France, and France had a military alliance with Britain. Hitler had to move carefully. He had to find excuses to take Czechoslovakia one piece at a time. He found his excuse in the Sudetenland, the portion of Czechoslovakia bordering Germany. Sudetenland was heavily populated by people of German origin, although they had never been a part of Germany itself. That was Hitler's cue. Konrad Heinlein was their Führer. The people of the Sudetenland were told by Heinlein that they should be liberated. They were told Hitler was their liberator. The Nazis smuggled over their standard softening up equipment, blackjacks. And when the Czechs were beaten up, trying to combat, Hitler protested, claiming that the Germans were being persecuted and threatened war unless he got the Sudetenland. Hitler wanted to incorporate all German-speaking people into the Reich. There were those in England, France, and the United States who did not think this an unreasonable demand. Hitler called upon Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland. France was bound by a treaty created under the old Austrian Empire. France and Soviet Russia were linked in a defensive pact. Great Britain's destiny was linked with that of France. So Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Premier Delage of France all met in Munich. The result was a signed pact by Hitler assuring the world that if he was given the Sudetenland, no further territorial demands would be made. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. Mussolini's people were jubilant. They wanted peace. In Czechoslovakia, the Munich Pact was greeted by riots of protest. But Delage returned to France to be greeted by cheers from a relieved French people. And in Britain, a happy Chamberlain came back declaring that he had achieved peace in our time, one of the most tragic and ironic scenes in all history.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. we regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
But it was far from peace. Hitler moved into the Sudetenland on the 1st of October 1938. His people were jubilant. Here was the miracle man, they said, a man who conquered with words. This was a new kind of war, a delightful war. Bands and flowers and parades, a smiling war, a lovely war, not a shot fired, not a man hurt, not a woman or a child. War, it seemed to the German people, was a holiday. Hitler told his people he was content. He wanted no more territory. He guaranteed the integrity of the mutilated Czechoslovakian Republic. Thereupon, he paused to rest. Meanwhile, things hadn't been so peaceful in the Far East. There had been Japanese attacks on British and American warships, but still the West didn't retaliate or intervene. The most notorious of these attacks was the sinking of the American gunboat USS Panay on the 12th of December 1937. President Roosevelt, angered particularly by the 50 casualties, including 2 killed, proposed a naval blockade of Japan. But the British were fearful that this would lead to war. The Japanese, however, apologized. Chiang Kai-shek was left to fight on his own, though he did sign a non-aggression pact with Russia, which brought Mao Zedong's communists onto his side. Even so, the Japanese continued their remorseless drive. By autumn 1938, they had overrun Canton and were pressing the Chinese ever further westwards into the interior of their country. Chiang Kai-shek himself had been forced to withdraw his seat of government to Chongqing, deep in the Chinese interior. Britain and France merely sent protest notes to Tokyo. Chiang Kai-shek's stand against aggression did, however, catch the imagination of the USA. President Roosevelt advanced Chiang a $25 million loan to encourage him to continue to fight. Yet apart from American money, China's plight had brought merely words of sympathy from the West. The truth was that matters nearer home were seen as more pressing than the suffering of the Chinese people. Within 6 months of declaring that he wanted no more territory anywhere, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement. He marched in and took the whole of the Czech state, though he had specifically promised, "I have no further interest in the Czechoslovakian state. That is guaranteed. We want no Czechs." Austria and Czechoslovakia were gone without a fight, and Hitler was getting his control of Eastern Europe. Poland was next on the map. On the 28th of October 1938, Hitler demanded that Poland restore the port of Danzig to Germany, and had also demanded the right to construct road and rail links through the Polish corridor to East Prussia. The Poles refused.
Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Yugoslavien.
In March 1939, he reiterated his plans and demands once again, and once again they were turned down. By the end of the month, with tension rising, Britain and France declared that they would stand by Poland. In April, Hitler denounced his 1934 non-aggression pact with Poland and again repeated his demands for Danzig. In May, Hitler and Mussolini signed the Pact of Steel, This was a guarantee to support each other in any future war. The pot was now boiling. The tired old man of Munich now knew that there would be no peace in our time.
If an attempt were made to change the situation by force in such a way as to threaten Polish independence, why then that would inevitably start a general conflagration in which this country would be involved.
After his success at Munich, Hitler was sure that France and Britain would not fight. In August 1939, there was a crippling blow to the hopes of Britain and France. British and French military missions had earlier arrived in Moscow to confer with the Soviet government. So too had German representatives. And on the 21st of August, the world was set on its heels with the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other. Here were the admitted arch-enemies in a state of apparent friendship. It was too fantastic to make any sense. It didn't. The Germans hoped they could lull Russia into a false sense of security, and the Russians needed time to prepare for the fight they knew was coming. They'd read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, too, and knew he had his eyes on the rich Russian land. Confident that Russia was safely pigeonholed and that the democracies would not fight, the Nazis stood firm in the belief that all people of German blood belonged to them. They had moved into Danzig undercover and had subversed local stooges into running a campaign of terror to soften up the population. The people of Poland refused to budge. Hitler's propaganda machine hummed, warning them that masses of men, women and children must be prepared for war. But still Poland stood firm. Great Britain stood firm. France stood firm. And the rest of the world held its breath. Although they knew Britain and France had guaranteed the safety of the Polish borders, they also knew those countries were a long way off. During the last 2 weeks in August, the German armies had moved towards the Polish border, where they had assembled 70 divisions, many of them armored. From a military standpoint, the Poles were hopelessly outclassed by their predatory neighbors. They managed to mobilize barely 30 divisions, made up of infantry and cavalry. The difference in the two inevitable combatants was staggering. The German army secretly made ready. The way of living promised by Hitler for the next 1,000 years was about to be decided. The fire that had begun in Manchuria and spread through China and Ethiopia and Spain would now blaze around the world. Hitler had made that decision. His would be the way of the aggressor. His formula was simple enough. First, choose the victim, an army still living in the past, few planes, fewer tanks, outmoded guns and outmoded tactics. Choose an army relying upon courage rather than machines. Precisely at dawn, on the 1st of September, without warning, the German Wehrmacht rode over the Polish border. Then came the bombers of the Luftwaffe. before their invasion was 30 minutes old, the planes of the Luftwaffe were over Poland, attacking the Polish airfields. They wanted to catch the Polish Air Force flat-footed on the ground. Most planes that did get off faced overwhelming odds and were shot out of the sky. Hitler had implemented one of his most effective methods of warfare, blitzkrieg. Most of the Polish Air Force was wiped out without warning. Those who managed to get off the ground were blasted from the skies. Then came the bombers, wave after wave. They hit the railroads. This stopped the Polish army moving men and supplies. Its armies became isolated. The mass ground unit of the Nazi army continued their advance. Occasionally, they unveiled a new technique or item of equipment. For example, advance units of the German Fourth Army crossed the Vistula in a new type of storm boat. But still the Poles, despite being hopelessly overwhelmed, bravely resisted. The heroic strains of the Polonaise told an incredulous world that the people of Warsaw, led by Mayor Straczynski, had erected a wall of courage around their city, defying Hitler to do his damnedest. Stopped cold by the city's desperate resistance, the Nazis were forced to send for heavier artillery. Guns subjected the city to a bombardment of incredible fury. Their fire concentrated on the densely populated residential areas. for 20 days of death and horror, every man, woman, and child fought to save his city. Without food or water, human endurance failed. On the 27th of September, the strains of the Polonaise died on the Warsaw radio, and the Polish capital was forced to capitulate. The port of Danzig came under attack from the German battleship, the Schleswig-Holstein. With its guns silenced, its forts shattered, the Poles holding the port still refused to surrender, even under point-blank fire at only 800 yards range. This was an exhibition of Polish valor that will go down in history. But militarily, it could not avail. On the 1st of October, the garrison at last surrendered. Poland now faced a bleak future under the might of the Nazi jackboot. Polish prisoners of war were marched off to Nazi prison camps and eventual extermination. For the Nazi master race theory called for the complete wiping out of so-called inferior races. And in village after village, local informants point out loyal Polish neighbors. This was a time the Poles would never forget. The world now knew that a non-aggression pact with Hitler was the kiss of death. Poland was completely overwhelmed on all flanks. During the last days of the campaign, the Russian army had attacked eastern Poland and took up positions along the River Bug. The two strongest armies in Europe now faced each other. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The rest is history.
And for the sake of peace, we put up with a lot of things happening which ought not to have happened. But now we are at war. And we are going to make war, and persevere in making war until the other side have had enough of it. We have been agreeably surprised that 10 weeks have been allotted to us to get into fighting trim. We are in a very different position from that we were in 10 weeks ago. We are far stronger than we were 10 weeks ago. We are far better prepared to endure the worst malice of Hitler and his Huns than we were at the beginning of September. It's growing in numbers and improving in training every day. I shall not attempt to prophesy whether the frenzy of a cornered maniac will drive Herr Hitler into the worst of all his crimes. But this I will say, without a doubt, that the fate of Holland and Belgium, like that of Poland, Czechoslovakia and Austria, will be decided by the victory of the British Empire and the French Republic. If we are conquered, all will be enslaved, and the United States will be left single-handed to guard the rights of men. If we are not destroyed, all these countries, ancient countries, many of them, will be rescued and restored to life and freedom. It may well be that the final extinction of a baleful domination
will pave the way to a broader solidarity of all the men in all the lands than we could ever have planned if we had not marched together through the fire.